And Roger is going to talk to us today about how language understanding unfolds in minds and machines. And I think this is his first time giving the talk with a mask on.
It is my first time giving a talk with a mask on.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, so we're going to start.
All right, we're going to take it away. Thanks. It's also my first time in Pittsburgh here, and this is, of course, LTI is an institute for our field, which has an amazing history, and you've all made so many contributions here. So it's a really an honor to be a speaker here. It's an honor to be the first speaker here, and it's an honor and a bit of a I have a lot of trepidation about being the first speaker in live since the pandemic started. So this is an experiment and experience. I'll start by saying, does anybody happen to recognize this picture? I like to use this picture to kick off my talk when I start on this general topic. So this is an illustration from one of the original drawings of the Charles Dickens novel Great Expectations. And I like this. It's interesting. If you've read it, you know this already. But expectations that's a word that's very important for what I'm going to talk about today. Interestingly, historically, the word "great expectations" in that book has a double meaning. So today, of course, expectations means what you think is likely to happen. But it also had another meaning that was more prominent at the time, which is an inheritance that you will come into in the future, your expectation, what you will get when somebody dies. And this is a part of the story. If you know the story, this is a part where the protagonist, this kid here, is being introduced to this rich benefactor by this guy right here. And that's sort of the beginning of the main body of the story in some ways. It's an early part of the book. Later on in the story, the main character gets quite surprised. And surprise is also a crucial part of what I'm going to talk about today. So if you haven't read the book, I strongly encourage you to. It's a great novel. This talk I will be talking about is in the context of a broader research program, my broader research program on how we understand language, how we use language to communicate so well, despite all the ways that could go wrong. And I think you're already familiar with the ways that it could go wrong. So language is ambiguous. As a famous example, the women discussed the dogs on the beach. It could be the women who are on the beach. It could be the dogs on their beach. Both of them could be on the beach, but the sentence is only on one. Each interpretation is only that it's a commitment by the speaker that either the women or the dogs are on the beach at the time they're discussing. And we can actually describe the difference in the sentence structure that corresponds to that meaning difference with mathematical tools like context-free grammatical trees, parse trees. Language, this is only one of many ways in which language is ambiguous. Most sentences of any appreciable length that we encounter in natural life have many, many interpretations, but we're incredibly good at zeroing in on the interpretation that it is or is very close to what the speaker intended. We're incredibly well calibrated to each other. And so that success is a remarkable feat, and we forget about how hard it is. When in our everyday language use, it's easy to forget about how hard that is. But that's been the subject of tremendous research in natural language processing to actually make that work pretty well even. Other aspects of language understanding that could go wrong, environmental noise. This is not a perfect communicative environment. Even if I have my mask off, there would be some degree of uncertainty about words I say because of the limits of the precision of my articulation and the limits of hearing and distance and echo and so forth. And there are much more difficult situations like cocktail parties, of course. Nevertheless, we're very successful a lot of the time. Language can tax our memory. It's hard to juggle multiple things at once in one's mind and compute on them simultaneously. And so language understanding happens through this constrained memory channel of our minds. And finally, we don't know everything about the people we're talking about. If you knew everything about me and I knew everything about you, then you'd be able to predict what I would say. I wouldn't need to say it, and we could all go home. We'd be done. There would be no talk, no reason to have a talk. But of course, here we are. It's because of that incompleteness of our knowledge of each other that communication is even meaningful to talk about. But if we knew nothing about each other, of course, we wouldn't share any conventions by which we could package up meaning and put it into a forum and send it to each other in a way that we could expect and hope that our interlocutor would understand. So all of these things are almost, they're barriers to, but also sometimes even constitutive of communication. I want to understand how we do that so well, how we learn the tools to do that so well from our infancy, and how we can get machines to do the same. And that, in the big picture, in my view, is the enterprise of computational psycholinguistics triangulating on a model of human-like language use and knowledge and learning. And that includes the recruitment of various tools from science and engineering, including linguistic theory, which has a long and I think actually quite successful history over less than a century, but you can also trace it back, its origins much farther. Computational models from more symbolic techniques to probabilistic models to deep learning. Data sets, of course, we live in the era of big data, and we now have data sets of language, of text, that are orders of magnitude larger than the lifetime of a native speaker. And so we can actually do things like approximate, estimate the kind of linguistic experience that an individual has had, or that an individual might have. And we can see the distribution that that looks like, and we can study it. And finally, experimentation, studying human behavior and also studying the brain. I'm not going to talk about the brain today, but that's part of the big picture. Now, what does that look like in the modern NLP era? How do we do this kind of triangulation? As you all know, deep learning has revolutionized language modeling. And so these are maybe the two workhorse models, the LSTM and the transformer. And I will say that when I started looking closely, I wasn't one of the earliest movers to start working with deep learning models. When I started, I was quite skeptical about the sophistication of the kinds of generalizations that these models might be making. Sure, they have much better perplexity. Sure, they can do open vocabulary, these were things that were challenges for pre-deep learning models 10 years ago even. And, but they're probably doing something like patching together local statistics and doing that in sophisticated ways, memorizing little chunks of text. And maybe we haven't done clever enough held out data evaluation, and so we're fooling ourselves as to how good these models actually are. And so when I started looking closely at this, I'm a practitioner of both natural language processing and also psycholinguistics. And so I took my psycholinguistics hat and I thought, well, how would I do this? I would do controlled experiments. I would create specific setups that I know are challenging for interesting reasons, for theoretically interesting reasons, and ones that that shed light into how language works in the human mind. So let me just give you some examples. These are old models now, so this is going to be generations from a model that's already 5 years old, Josefovitz et al. 2016. This was the first deep learning model that was trained on the billion-word benchmark. I think actually even now, I think that the continuations that it generates are instructive and thought-provoking. So I'm going to show you. So for example, I gave it the prefix, the girl who the newspaper. So this is an autoregressive language model. So it'll generate left to right to continuations, and I can give it a beginning context. The girl who the newspaper, and it generated, now calls his girlfriend has been really hateful. Okay. And you look at it and that seems ridiculous. But no, I look at it and I say, hey, that's pretty good. It's weird out of context. Who's his? I don't know who his is. It's generated out of context. And why is there like the girl and the girlfriend? But actually, if you look at it closely, it's not too bad at all. In fact, it's quite good. So the newspaper calls this girl some person's girlfriend. That's a reasonable thing. And that girl has been really hateful. It's a totally well-formed sentence. It means it's a little bit weird out of context because of that his pronoun, but it's a perfectly good sentence. Anybody know? I like try to be interactive, so I'm going to ask questions. Please respond or raise your hand or whatever. Anybody know why I might have chosen that context? The girl who the newspaper? Anybody have a sense of that? Yeah.
Is it for a long distance dependency?
It is. It's a long distance dependency. Yes, that's right. So in particular, it sets up dependency where girl and has is a subject-verb combination. Yeah. And in particular, it's also it's a little bit more than that. And I'm going to show you the next example to give you even more insight into why I chose this kind of example. So I'm going to give this a green check mark for this was a success of this model. How about this? The monologue that the actor who the movie industry. Yeah, go ahead.
You're sort of pushing into deeper recursion.
Perfect. Yes, exactly. So I'm pushing in a deep level recursion. So in this case, notice that at the point of the newspaper, I actually have to have two verbs. One that the newspaper is the subject of, and one that the girl is the subject of. And those both have to happen. And so I have to have the right number of verbs. So this, if you go back to the history of natural language syntax, this is what are called, these are nested object extracted relative clauses in English. And these were one of the crucial arguments at the dawn of generative linguistics for the argument for hierarchical structure in human language. And this is one level more of nesting dependencies. The monologue that the actor who the movie industry. Now I have two levels of object embedded relative clauses, or non-subject embedded relative clauses. I have to have three verbs. One that the movie industry is a subject of, one that the actor is a subject of, one that the monologue is a subject of. Let's see what it is. The monologue that the actor who the movie industry likes made silent was being uploaded. And you look at that and they say, that's absurd. But no, I look at it and I say, I have to turn down my semantic style and turn up my syntax style, and I realize this is a beautiful completion. And it makes sense. It's a weird meaning, but it was actually not even that weird a meaning. So the movie industry likes the actor. The actor made the monologue silent, and the monologue was being uploaded. Totally well-formed sentence. It actually isn't even that weird of a meaning. It's incredibly hard for a human to process, and that's a well-studied phenomenon. But it actually is grammatically really nice. So I'm going to give that a really great work model. Okay. The man who the car, it doesn't always succeed. The man who the car has gazed longingly at for years doesn't have enough verbs. And then this model, I think one of the big successes since this model in the last 5 years is that the models have gotten better and better at not creating things that I can't even understand what they're doing. So the athlete who the restaurant would justify decided to add the main West Coast restaurants to his menu and who hadn't upgraded from his previous sweet comment into a more steakhouse in New York period. I don't even know what to say about that. Okay. Okay, so this was the early days of me sort of trying to understand what are these models doing well, and why am I interested in this? So to me, once you start to, there are these perennial questions of any AI language model, but before the contemporary deep learning models, I would say that none of them were reasonably good enough to really ask the following pair of questions. So there's a technical question. What generalizations are these models learning? That's an important open question because the models themselves are not easily interpretable. So that is the model interpretation. The interpretability problem is a significant problem in deep learning. And the other is a theoretical reason. So if we look in the theory of human language acquisition and learnability, the classic formulation of the learnability problem for natural language is the question of how well would positive input data alone deliver the right linguistic generalizations to a generic flexible learner that does not have a strong hierarchical bias? Okay. By positive input data alone, I mean the general characterization that is the majority view in the language development community, that to a first approximation, the child receives no negative evidence. The child is learning from instances that they've experienced of what is done or is okay in the language, but does not learn from instances of what is not okay. They don't get teaching of the form, that's not okay. Now, there's an open debate and question that one can ask about, is that really the right characterization? How much negative evidence might the child have? But I'm going to take it from the sort of the majority consensus that this is at least not horribly off. Okay. And so what we can do is we can sort of imagine, let's take one of these models and just hypothesize, what if it were in the mind of the child that's the child learner? What generalizations could it make? Would it make? Is it making? From string input data alone. So this is the advantage here, is that we can now take a lifetime's or a childhood's worth of linguistic data, train the model, and then test its generalization capabilities. What generalizations does it acquire, and how strong are they, and what are they like? Okay, and why I'm focusing here on grammatical generalizations, and I'm going to set aside, today in NLP, there's always been, and especially now, there's a huge interest in using language to learn about common sense reasoning. And likewise, there's a lot of interest in what facts about the world could we acquire from text alone. And while I think that is a very interesting enterprise, I'm going to set it aside for today and focus on grammatical generalizations. And here's the reason why I do that. To me, this is a uniquely interesting and important and compelling opportunity and scientific challenge. We know that languages vary dramatically across the world in structure. So if I take an English utterance like I bought the bed, and I were to ask how would I communicate that in another language? For example, in Japanese, it would be very different, beddo katta. So Japanese has prodrop, so the subject doesn't appear. It's verb final obligatorily. The distinction between a subject and object is marked by morphology, not by word order. I can go into other languages like Oneida, and I have a wa kenaktu ahninu. This is my pronunciation. I don't even know how bad that is, but I'm sure it's bad. Which is it's a polysynthetic language, and so the entire utterance is packaged up into a single word with interesting things to say about the morpheme order and so forth. And this is just a very, very small sample, of course, of the thousands of languages and the wide variety of grammatical features and combinations of grammatical features that languages have. And at the same time, of course, there are strong and perhaps even universal generalizations across language. Like languages have grammatical categories. Words fall into parts of speech. Syntax, structure, there's heads and hierarchy, which is the basis of compositionality, of course, which is one of the central features of language. But above and beyond compositionality, there's also idiosyncrasy. So it's not always the case that it's useful to say that a phrase's meaning is the combination of its parts. There are exceptions to that. But there are also, importantly, there are exceptions. And there's things to say about the nature of exceptionality. So the fact, and unlike this in some sense, the variability and sort of non-grammatical stuff about language, first of all, is it's sometimes harder to study, but B, it's sort of more obviously culturally bound with specific experience with the community, whereas you can't predict the grammatical properties of a language from the nature of community. I mean, you may have a few things you might be able to do with some prediction, but in a sense, language has this sort of autonomy, and it must be learned as a system in and of itself. And so this question of how much you could learn, what is a lower bound on what you could learn, what kind of learner could learn what, from the linguistic data alone, is a very interesting theoretical problem. And for decades, it has stood very prominently in linguistics and cognitive science as a problem. And this ranges from work in computer science, like Gold's language identification and the limit framework, which was maybe the first really landmark work in this area, to theoretical syntax like C.L. Baker's The Projection Problem, to more recent synthesis works like Clark and Lappin, Linguistic Nativism and the Poverty of the Stimulus. So that's why I am focusing on the learning of grammar. And that's not to say that that's the most interesting thing for everybody, but you know, it's the most interesting thing for me here, perhaps. So here's my strategy and the argument that I'm going to make today. So the strategies is I'm going to take these contemporary models and I'm going to run controlled experiments on them as if they were subjects in a psycholinguistic experiment. And that's not even really just as a psycholinguistic experiment. Basic linguistic analysis is effectively a whole bunch of little controlled experiments where I look at two different versions of a sentence that are very different. For example, the bear walk versus the bear walks. I observe that the bear walk is anomalous in some sense, and it informs me, and the bear walks is not, and it informs me as to a theory of like how I write a little bit of the English grammar. And it's the basis, the empirical basis of the theory of the grammar is actually those contrasts. And so I want to build contrasts like that. And it turns out that you need the methodology of controlled psycholinguistic experiments to do this, I think, most effectively. And the conclusions that I'm going to get to are that standard deep learning models learn remarkably subtle features of human grammar from a childhood's worth of linguistic input, even without real-world grounding. But that they're not quantitatively aligned with human comprehension behavior when expectations about grammatical structure are violated. So there's a story here about learning, and there's a story here about sort of processing. And I'm going to sort of show you pieces of both of those things. Okay. So the last thing that I want to say is, so the conclusion of that is that deep learning models offer insights into learnability, and they're a powerful scientific tool for estimating human linguistic expectations, which on the basis of this sort of all of those problems, ambiguity management, dealing with noise, reasoning about your interlocutor, those expectation management problems are central. And I'm going to argue for that. So the deep learning models actually are good as a tool for estimating those things. They're sort of a statistical estimation tool. but they're not a theoretical account of how language processing works in the mind or brain. And so I want to set up the stage here, just the general nature of how language understanding in the human mind unfolds. Okay? So the general case is that at any particular moment when you're listening or reading, you're in the middle of a sentence most of the time, at any particular moment. Okay, so very, very few moments in this talk so far have I been at a sentence boundary. Okay, and so that means that there's some very recent context within the sentence. There's some outside of sentence information that includes both language information like the broader discourse and non-linguistic information like the visual and social environment. And then I'm constantly tacitly making predictions about what's going to come next, even if I'm not consciously aware enough about it. And those predictions affect how I process in my mind current input. Of course, this is happening in real time, so current input becomes past input, part of the context, and the whole thing is going on consistently. And this expectation generation is effortless and almost hard to stop. So I'm going to give you a few examples illustrating this. So for example, if I gave you the context, Jamie was clearly intimidated, you have something in your mind that comes next, and if this is consistent with what came in your mind next, raise your hand. Great. And you certainly, if you thought the next word was by, I'm sure most people thought that. And the source of intimidation comes next, so that's sort of an interesting phrasal structure. Despite the fact that if I look at the surface statistics of the word intimidated on its own, most of the time what comes next is going to be what got intimidated, not the source of the intimidation. So there's syntax, that is the fact that we're in a passive voice construction together with the semantics of the word and the broader context that are going to guide those. But there are also different levels of constraints. So for example, phonological knowledge. If I give you the context, Terry ate an, raise your hand if it's any of these that comes to your mind. Lots and lots of people. Raise your hand if it's any of those in this context. No, it's not. It's going to be something like one of these, right? And that, once again, that's an interaction of syntax that says the next thing that's going to come next is probably a noun. With semantics, what comes next is probably an edible thing. With phonology, what comes next should start either with a vowel or with not with a vowel, depending on whether it's A or N. And all that stuff happens super fast at the millisecond time scale. And then there's much richer, like situational semantic knowledge. The children went outside too. You all thought play. The squirrels stored some nuts in the. You all thought statue. No, you didn't. You thought tree. Raise your hand if you thought tree. Raise your hand if you thought something besides tree. Where do squirrels store their nuts in? The ground. Raise your hand if you thought of ground. Isn't that interesting? Most people thought of tree, not ground. So what that shows is that even in a situational and semantic knowledge situation, you will not be able to reduce language processing down entirely to sort of world knowledge. There's something else going on, because the world knowledge is that they store it in the ground, much more so than in trees. So language processing has a rich, rich, complex life and structure. How do we study that? We do a lot of different things. I'm going to show you, and so these expectations form diverse contextual cues affect language processing very quickly. How do we study this? Many different ways. I'm going to just give you a mention of why we spend a lot of time using reading to study it. Not because we think reading is the most important type of language use. It's almost surely parasitic on spoken or signed languages. However, reading gives us a lot of empirical methodological leverage in studying how language understanding unfolds in people. Just to help you understand this, I want to give you a little bit of information about how we actually read. So you might think subjectively, your subjective experience, if you haven't thought about this before, is that it's a matter of your eyes sort of continually moving across the page and your attention following it. But that is very far from the truth. In fact, eye movements during reading are not smooth. They're what are called saccadic. And to show you this is a video where the red dot is using an eye tracker to see where on the page the person is fixated at any one time. And so this is an illustration of how that works. And you can see that for most of the time, the eyes are almost stationary. They're jittering in what's called a microsaccade, but effectively they're stationary in terms of the time scale, the spatial scale of the text, and then they jump extraordinarily quickly. Okay. Basically, this is happening about 4 times a second, those saccades, those jumps, and the fixations last between 250 and 200 milliseconds. But the duration of those fixations actually carries information about language processing. The eye movement record in reading is extremely tightly linked. It's noisily linked, but it's a lot of signal to language processing in the mind. So as a very simple classic example, if I give a context like the hikers slowly climbed up where you're almost certain to expect mountain, you might expect hillside, but it's much, much less likely. Well, mountain and hillside are fairly well controlled. They're the same length. They're about the same frequency. Those are things we know matter for processing, so we control those out. But if we use this context and put put either of those words in that context, what we see is that the high probability word is the predictable word is more likely to be skipped altogether. And if you don't skip it, you're likely to spend fewer milliseconds, in this case, 20 milliseconds the first time your eyes move to it, or in total, as you read the sentence, about 65 milliseconds less than the less predictable word. That's below the level, most of the time that's below the level of conscious awareness for these kinds of mild things, like mountain versus hillside, but they're measurable. They're psychometrically measurable. Okay, so, and one thing I've spent a lot of time doing is trying to study this quantitatively, to build a quantitative psychological science of human language processing. And it turns out that a very basic information-theoretic metric is very effective for this, and that's the word surprisal. So the surprisable word in its context is simply the log of the inverse of the conditional probability of the word given its context. For isolated sentences, for example, it's just the preceding words. And this captures that expectation, intuition. Our brains are predicting all the time. So, and predictable words, we know that they're read faster. They also have distinctive EEG responses. So if you study the N400 at all, if you know about that, that's a canonical response to every word that is measurable from your scalp. The size of that response is also indexable by the size of the N400. And any language model that we have, if it captures either explicitly or implicitly syntactic structure, we'll be able to get grammatical expectations about it. So this is our hypothesis, that the shape of the relationship between probability and work as measurable by time is captured by this negative log or log inverse probability relationship. And we've studied this by having people read large stretches of text using different methods, including eye tracking like I just showed you, but also other methods, and use big data, large amounts of text, and multivariate statistical analysis to control for confounding variables, like the fact that we know that word frequency affects language processing, and word frequency is it's the simplest possible estimate of word probability and context, and so they're intrinsically correlated. But if you get enough data, you get scatter, and you can use multivariate methods to pull it out. And when you do this, you actually do find, it turns out, and this is a remarkable result I continue to believe, that the relationship between the probability of a word and its context and how long you tend to read it is a linear relationship, very close to linear relationship, over orders of magnitude in word probability. So that allows us, in terms of sort of science methods and theory building, to talk about things like time per bit, information-theoretic bit. Okay, so that's a bit about how language processing unfolds in humans. What about in machines? So it turns out that the logic, there's a logic that you can use to study the behavior of these models that actually closely matches what I just talked about in human language processing. So in work that we've done, this is a subset of the models that we looked at, that Josefovitz et al. Model, but also more recently, there's a Guler-David et al. 2018 LSTM model that actually does really well grammatically. And then the GPT models, recurrent neural network grammars, and then sort of a no syntax control for the recurrent neural network grammar, and of course N-gram model baselines. We have different architectures, ones, LSTMs, transformers, and then models that integrate syntax and deep learning. Is there a question up there or no? Okay. And let me just show you, and just to give you some reference points, so 90 million words is maybe a human childhood worth of linguistic experience by some estimates. And 800 million words is maybe a human lifetime of linguistic experience. Okay. And of course, the GPT models are trained on many, many times over a human lifetime worth of experience. Okay, so let me show you the simplest possible way, perhaps, of studying this. Sure, and I want to sort of point out that these methods are related to, but I sort of see them as an extension of Tal Linzen's work on subject-verb agreement that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where you just give a context and you want to predict whether the verb should be singular or plural, and the challenge is to do that to be sensitive to the right noun. Okay, but what we'll argue is that you can extend that sort of fundamental idea to much more subtle and indirect measures of grammatical processing, and it actually reveals really some of the sophistication of what these models are picking up. So let me illustrate this with the kind of approach that we take. So the doctor studied the textbook, perfectly well-formed sentence, right? As the doctor studied the textbook, period. Not okay, right? That sentence falls off a cliff. The doctor studied the textbook, comma, the nurse walked into the office. Not great, probably, right? It's a little weird, but it's definitely not as bad as the doctor studied the textbook. As the doctor studied the textbook, comma, the nurse walked into the office. Now it's good. Okay. So if you look at this and you're familiar with sort of controlled experiments, you'll realize that the presence or absence of as and the presence or absence of a second clause after the first clause form a factorial experimental design. Okay. And that factorial experimental design, the relationship between those two factors and the goodness of the sentence is what we call an interaction. Both as and the second clause have to be there together, or neither should be there. Okay. Now, how do we use language models to study this? And there's a couple of different ways we can do it, but here's one that I think gives a lot of insight. What we do is we divide each of the sentences into a context and then a completion. Okay, and we'll be interested in the surprisal of the completion given the context. And because this is in log probabilities, you can sort of think of the number of that log probability is like the number of bits of information that the completion gives you. Okay, from the infinity of possibilities the way the continuation might have been. And we do this, so this is that completion, and here are the completions and the uncircled things of the contexts. And what we do is we make two predictions, and the predictions are that there should be surprisal asymmetries in opposite directions. So if we call the first two ones the versions that don't have what's called a matrix clause, no subsequent matrix clause, and the bottom ones are ones that do. So here the surprisal difference should be positive. So this, if we take this surprisal, that should be a very high number because it's a very unusual, very low probability. Log it, get a really, really big negative number, and then take the negative, you should get a big positive number. This is less surprising, so it should be a less big positive number. And so when I subtract the surprisal at the top from the surprisal at the bottom, it should be a positive number. But if I do it in the bottom case, it should be a negative number. This is a less surprising continuation. It's a higher probability continuation than this. And notice what we've done here is that we've controlled the context, we've controlled the target perfectly. So we can really do an apples to apples comparison of the probability of this thing in two different contexts. Okay, and so what I'm going to predict is now the top is going to be red bars in the next couple of slides, and those red bars should be above 0, and the bottom is blue bars, and those should be below 0. So if I take my first two LSTM models, what you'll see is that actually they do only so-so. Okay, so they do well in the latter case. They both have a big blue negative bars. So the second matrix clause, the nurse walked into the office, is less surprising when as is in the context than when as isn't in the context. But actually that good-looking model from 2016, it doesn't mind at all for a sentence to end after as the doctor studied the textbook. It's not sensitive to that at all. The Gourler-Dava model trained on only a tenth the data is a little bit better. Well, we can compare that now. I'm going to look at much smaller models. So if I take only the Penn tree bank, 1 million words versus 800 million words or 90 million words, and train an LSTM on it, it has hardly any sensitivity at all. It does still get that sensitivity, as it does better with that second clause after as. But syntactic guidance turns out to be incredibly powerful here. So actually, the most human-like model in the sense that probably the red bar should be bigger than the blue bar, because the worst anomaly was having the sentence fall off a cliff after as the doctor studied the textbook. Even the recurrent neural network grammar doesn't get that, but it's closer. It's actually, at least these bars are about equally big. Okay. And so what we can see is that it's not, although data set size will turn out to matter in a lot of ways, there's more that matters than that. Okay, so that's sort of a warm up. But the main thing that I want to tell you about, which we've been looking at, is something that is going back to object relative clauses, which are an example, something that's really been at the center of linguistic syntactic theory for decades, which is what are called filler gap dependencies. Okay. So let's take this example. I know what the lion devoured at sunrise at the top. You recognize that as a perfectly well-formed sentence. Okay. But it's an interesting sentence, and what I want to call your attention to is the lack of an object after devoured, which I'm representing by that double underscore, with the presence of the word what before the line devoured and after I know. So that word what is what's called a filler, and the blank is a gap. It's something that's missing where ordinarily something there would be. And that is something that is representable and indeed represented in syntactic theories as a dependency relationship between the presence of a filler, which makes it possible to have a gap where ordinarily you would have an object-noun phrase. So these tree structural descriptions are a theoretical basis on which we can actually elegantly write out the distribution of these fillers and gaps and lacks of fillers and lacks of gaps in many, many different configurations. Okay. And that's been a major object of study in the field of syntax. I'll call this version of the sentence the plus filler plus gap condition, because both there's a filler and there's a gap. Now, if I change only one of those things, for example, if I get rid of the filler, I change it to, I know that the lion devoured at sunrise. Now you recognize that that's a really weird sentence. I'm going to put a star, that is. It's not it feels anomalous. And the reason is because devoured is an obligatorily transitive verb, grammatical property. And devoured requires an object. And you need a filler in order for it not to have an object. This doesn't have a filler. That is not a filler in this situation. And so this is not an OK sentence. Okay, so that's an anomaly. The minus filler plus gap version is not OK. The plus filler minus gap version is not OK either. I know what the lion devoured, the gazelle at sunrise. Now it feels like what's the gazelle doing there, right? It shouldn't be there. There's something too much in the sentence. But if I get rid of both the filler and the gap, then it's fine. I know that the lion devoured the gazelle at sunrise. And so once again, this is like an interaction design where you have to have either the two factors co-present or co-absent. Okay. Now notice that unlike both of these cases that I just described, if we sort of think of like the better studied case of subject-verb agreement, this is interestingly different in the following way. Both the first example and the second example were not just about the dependency, whereas in subject-verb agreement, it's about which of two forms occurs here and here, and a co-occurrence relationship. In both of the examples that I'm showing you here, it's about the co-occurrence between which form here and the presence or absence of something in one place, and the presence or absence of something in another place, in the case of subordination, or here, which form, that or what form here, and the presence or absence of something here. So it's not simply about which form do two words take, but it's about whether, and not just a single word, it's a phrase. There's an infinite set of possible noun phrases. So it's potentially a more subtle feature. And also, I'll show you the distribution is quite complex. Okay, and this has been very important to study over the decades. So now these dependencies are a signature, theoretically crucial feature of natural language grammar, and I'm going to show you how we study them here. So here's a slightly different version, a slightly different sentence pair, but it illustrates the same thing. So I know that the CEO showed the slides to the guest after lunch. So and I compare that to the that versus what versions here. And I'll call this is the no gap versions of the sentence. And what you see here, what I'm showing you here is a mean by word surprisal in the different words of the different parts of the sentence. This is actually the kind of visualization, the kind of analysis that we do when we study how language processing unfolds in humans over the course of a string. And what you see is that in this crucial location, there's a small effect of where when the filler is absent, that is the green bar, there is less surprise at the slides than when the filler is present, when the word was in the context. And now, at this point, the sentence is not ungrammatical. Okay, because I don't know yet what happens after the slides. I know what the CEO showed the slides. I know what the CEO showed the slides to, or showed the slides on. I know what the CEO showed the slides on would be a perfectly good way of continuing the sentence. However, we know from classic studies in psycholinguistics that actually there is a surprise effect here for humans. It's called the filled gap effect. That filler creates an expectation for a gap. And if that expectation is not met, then it's actually a measurable reading time difference. And what we see is that the surprisal effect in these models is actually analogous. I can also show you the gap version. So now I'm going to focus on what happens right after the gap, because there's nothing to measure at this position. There's nothing here. But now here, if I don't have a filler, I should be surprised not to get an object. And that should be a bigger problem than the other one. The other one is just like, OK, I lost an opportunity to fill the gap, but there's always other opportunities downstream. Now here, I have an unaccountable gap if the context doesn't have what? If the context has that. And you actually see this bigger difference at this word too. Okay, and so that's the unlicensed gap surprise effect. And so you can see this is actually, this whole thing is, both these things are a human-like processing pattern. And then I can basically I can sort of collapse it out, and now the red is the case where there is the first two examples, and the blue is the second two examples. Sorry, I think I have the colors reversed from what I wanted. But what you see, this sort of signature surprise in one direction. So the WH effect is sort of the difference in the surprise at the region, depending on whether it's that or what. So it's that difference in the two contexts. And I'm more surprised not to get a gap when I have what in the context, and I'm less surprised to get a gap when I have a what in the context. And those are a signature of human-like processing. So once again, I'm going to show you graphs where human-like processing is blue bars below 0, red bars above 0. And so what we did is we took a bunch of these models that I just showed you, and we analyzed filler gap dependencies in a number of different basic locations: subject, object, prepositional phrase. And you can see I have the GPT models, and I have those two LSTM models. N-gram baselines obviously have no effect because the N-gram windows don't capture any of this. So that's just a sanity check. But what we can see is that all of these models have these effects. Another thing you see is that actually the magnitude of the effect, which is an interpretable thing, is actually not like sort of what we conventionally think of the quality of the model is not necessarily highly predictive of the magnitude of the effect. Okay, but they all actually do capture this. Just a few more things about these dependencies. So we can embed them. So I know what our mother gave to Mary last weekend. Well, we can put different levels of causal embedding. I know what our mother said that your friend gave to Mary last weekend. That's 0 and 1, and we can extend this to 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so if we do this, what we see this, and this is a pretty interesting pattern, which is and I'll just show you it here for object gaps. Interestingly, while all these models actually do have these things persist, actually the transformer models seem to be a little worse than the LSTMs in actually maintaining these filler gap dependencies. So once again, the basic signature is there. So these subtle features are actually learned automatically by these models. However, what we conventionally think of as which are the best models from like a raw perplexity point of view, for example, doesn't necessarily correspond closely to which ones have sort of the most robust human-like processing. Now I'm going to rule out a couple of confounds here. Confound number 1. Could these models be learning? I've argued that this is sort of like signature syntax, but syntax is hierarchical. So maybe they're just learning that, but when you have a gap earlier, or sorry, when you have a filler earlier, you need to have a gap later. That's a linear relationship potentially. Could they be learning a linear relationship? And to rule out that confound, we note that a filler gap dependency has a hierarchical condition, that a filler must be appropriately above its gap. So if the gamma is the filler, then the gap needs to be somewhere here. It can't be up here higher in the syntax. Okay? And so we can create natural language structures that actually test this. So we do this by examples like this. The fact that the mayor knows who, and here are two different ways I could continue this. The fact that the mayor knows who the criminal shot shocked the jury. And you can see that that's a perfectly good sentence. But now and so here the gap is down here. It follows linearly who, but it's down here below who in the tree structure. But I could also do it this way. The fact that the mayor knows who the criminal shot the teller shocked. And now you realize that that's a really weird sentence. It's not okay. Still, the gap is linearly after the who, but now it's in the syntax. It's above where it should be. Okay, and so let me show you. And so basically, like we set this up, and the way we do this is that we sort of think there's a clause boundary at this point where this complex subject ends and the main clause begins. And we have 3 different versions where there is no gap up here. There's a gap in the subject here, and there's a gap in the matrix clause. And so the expectations that I have, this is what I want a human-like signature would look like, is that I should have, this is the WH effect. Like what is my change in Surprisal at every particular point in the sentence as a function of changing that to who. So I should have this, oh, a filled gap effect. Oh, wait a minute. Why is the teller there? I thought there would be a gap there. That should happen at the teller. It should not happen at the jury, because that's out of the domain of the filler gap dependency. What about if I do have a gap? If I have a gap inside the subject, then I should have facilitation immediately after the gap from the filler. But I should not have that if the gap occurs in the matrix clause. So this is the pattern that I expect. Facilitation, these effects inside the subordinate clause early, but not inside the matrix clause late. And that's exactly what I get. So in each of these, once again, blue should be down and red should be up for human-like processing. The first pair of bars in each panel is inside the subject early, and the second pair of bars in each panel is outside late. And what you can see is the effects are much, much smaller it's not perfect, but they're much, much smaller in the place where it's not licensed from a filler gap from a syntactic point of view. And actually, you can also see this is a very different sort of like shrinking pattern than what we saw with just clausal embedding, where it was sort of this very gradual change. Okay, so I think we've ruled out potential concern number one, at least behaviorally here. They don't seem to be learning just a linear dependency. They're sensitive to hierarchy. Okay, so now I want to move on to an even more interesting learning problem, which is what are called syntactic islands. Okay, syntactic islands are a condition on filler gap dependency, which also have been central in importance to the whole enterprise of syntax for decades. Okay, and in short, what an island is it's a kind of phrase that blocks a filler gap dependency. So if X is an island, then a filler outside the island cannot license a gap inside the island, but it can license a gap across the island. And island effects have long been regarded as strong motivation for domain-specific innate constraints on human language, partly because they're sort of a second-order thing. So you have there's the filler gap dependency that says what's okay, and then the island constraint is like a second-order or even third-order thing on that. It's like, here's a case where that special thing can't work. Okay, and furthermore, there's an argument that like the conditions for even having them would be rare in the input, so how would you learn them from the input alone? So I'll just give you one example of how we study this. Let's take this example again. I know what Alex said, your friend devoured at the party. It's fine. Now, after the word said and before the word your, if I add the word that, then it doesn't change much. I know what Alex said, that your friend devoured at the party. That might feel a little bit weird, but it's pretty okay. And then finally, I know what Alex said, whether your friend devoured at the party. Now this probably feels much, much worse than the other two. Does that sound right? I know what Alex said, whether your friend devoured at the party. Can you even make sense of what that means? No. What it means is there's something X, and Alex said whether your friend devoured X at the party, and I know what X is. That's what it says. Can you get that meaning from that sentence? If you try, you can. If you practice, you can. But it's very unnatural. Whereas these two cases are very natural. Okay, and that it seems it's not about the sort of overall configuration. It's about something about whether. So let me show you what happens here. So this is the familiar graph that you saw before, basically, where there's nothing between ant and devoured. If I change it to that, then once again I sort of have red up, blue down. They both look pretty similar. The exact pattern changes, but it's still pretty big. But it almost entirely disappears if I change it, if I add that whether in. Okay. And this is consistent in all these different models. You can see the left-hand ones are the non-island condition, and the right-hand pairs are in each panel are the island condition, and the island effects are just tiny, whereas the sensitivity is very large in the non-island condition. So it's just changing that back to weather. Huge effect on islands. But now what about maybe there's another problem, a confound, which is that maybe these models have a difficulty threading any type of expectation into a syntactic island. And so what we do here is we look at a very different kind of expectation, not a syntactic expectation. Expectations about gender, which should not be sensitive to syntax in the same way. So we take stereotypically gendered nouns, and we see what the expectations for gender pronouns become. So for example, the actress said that they insulted her friends. I'm going to give that a check because that is a more expected pronoun here than her is more expected than his. His would be more surprising. It's not bad. It's just that it's less expected because the actress is a very plausible thing for a pronoun here to co-refer to. And so this gender expectation effect, this should be more surprising than this, so if I subtract the surprisal of this from this, I should have a positive number. And the question is, if I create a syntactic island, if I change that to whether, which had that huge effect on filler gap dependencies, does it also shrink out this effect? So that's the question. And basically the question is, does whether block this what should be from a linguistic point of view, this very different kind of dependency that shouldn't care about whether? And the answer is no. So this is in the non-island condition. You get this the mismatched pronoun is more surprising than the matched pronoun. Sad commentary on the gender bias in corpora. But when I change it to whether, nothing really changes. Okay. So we don't see any difference. And this is true, once again, across the models. So the top is what you already saw before. The effect of changing that to whether on syntax, on filler gap dependencies. This is the effect of changing that to whether on gender. There's basically no effect. Okay. So actually, this effect of whether seems to be more specific than just making the model confused and having no strong expectations or something like that. So I think we've ruled out potential concern number 2. Okay. Just a couple of very brief things I'll say near the end. I'll make just one plug. So these are samples from a much larger set of these controlled tests that cover many different features of grammar and that are also linked in many cases to existing studies in the literature from psycholinguistics, from sentence processing. And we have a website, syntaxgym.org, where you can browse the behavior of these models. There are visualization tools. You can even write your own test suites. You can download our test suites and you can run them on your own model with your own models. You can do all these things. These are all meant for autoregressive language models, and they're not meant to be trained on. You should think of them as out of distribution controlled tests. And so we're hoping that this will become more of a clearinghouse for this kind of research in our community. And then just the last thing I'll say is that another thing that we're trying to do is taking these deep learning models and connecting them back to trying to quantitatively calibrate the artificial model's expectations to what humans are doing. And the way we do this is we use methods for studying human reading times, and then we look and we build try to see how good a linear fit between surprisal and reading time works. And so the original linear fits that I showed you were for trigram models before deep learning. In today's era, it's a little noisier, but by and large, something linear or reasonably near linear for most of where the data are, it holds pretty well. We've also, in order to do this, especially during the pandemic, we've had to figure out new ways of studying human language processing moment by moment. And we do this by creating a better new way of measuring how much work it is for people to read words in a sentence. We do this with what's called the maze task. And the maze is a really cool, very simple task where it's just word by word, you choose a string that fits given the preceding context. So in this case, for example, push F versus J on your computer keyboard. So if this is the first word in the sentence, I would push F. Then I would be presented with this. I would push J. Then I would push F. Sorry, I would push J. And if I get it wrong, then I'm timed out or the trial ends. And it turns out that the amount of time that I take to make that decision has a huge amount of information about how difficult it was. And it actually corresponds very well, for the most part, with word surprisals. So as an example, here's one example. So we've compared human reaction times. This is classic garden pathing. So this is like the horse race past the barn fell. It's a different example. But this red bar right here is the maze response times on what's equivalently the word fell. Here, this is GPT-2 surprisals. And what you can sort of see a hint of, first of all, the qualitative monotonicities are good, but there's still some work left to do. The models are not quite getting everything right. So for example, the differences between these conditions are not as clearly differentiated as they are for humans. But what I want to point out here is that actually there's a whole frontier that I think we've got now, which is we can do more quantitative calibration of processing times, and also there's errors, how likely people are to make a mistake with language processing and what models predict. So we can sort of have a vision of quantitatively calibrating these models too. And we've actually tried to scale this up to many of the test suites in SyntaxGym. And one of the things that we're seeing is a more consistent pattern, which is that the residual errors on those linear fits are the worst for these red things. And these red conditions are ones that are anomalous from a grammatical point of view. And so what it's starting to show us that like the surprisals capture a lot, but they don't capture, there's a notion of anomaly in the human mind that's an important part of language processing. And that's not totally recapitulated by the word surprisals. And you sort of saw hints of that earlier on where I pointed out, look, the pattern is right, but maybe the sizes are not correct. So there's still room to build models that are truly, truly calibrated to human language-like processing for grammar, even when they're trained on orders of magnitude more language than the lifetime of human experience. So to sum up, my argument has been that standard deep learning models learn these very subtle features of human grammar from a childhood's worth of linguistic input. The Guler-Dava model has a childhood's worth of linguistic input and performs very well qualitatively. But the models or predictions are not yet quantitatively aligned with these human comprehension behavior when expectations about grammatical structure are violated. And so they offer insights into learnability. They're a tool for expectation estimation, but I don't think they're going to be a theoretical account of human language representing and processing at the end of the day. Just very briefly, here are a few things that I think are necessary for a comprehensive theoretical account of human language processing and learning. Things like noisy channel mechanisms for identifying anomalies, robustly cleaning up interpretations, not just figuring out what things should have been, but not just interpreting things the way they should be, but figuring out what the language should have been. Also, better representations of the nature of limits on memory fidelity. And then, of course, also we need semantic representations that can be evaluatable in grounded context. So we look at things like, for example, click on the rabbit and the big, and then we see what word people expect. And that involves a rich combination of the semantics of big, the syntax of complex noun phrases, incremental processing, and then, of course, grounded representations of context. And so all of these things are things that we're working on. So I want to thank my collaborators and funders, my lab, and of course, most of all, you for listening. Thanks very much.
Okay, we have time for questions. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. And for a thought, I have two questions. The first one is specifically about the part where you checked if language models are sensitive to, I think, syntax hierarchical versus linear.
Yeah.
And have you, so when the gap is lower than the filler, it's always closer to the gap, the filler, than when it's
Sure.
outside of that dominant
Yep.
relationship, right?
Yeah.
So was there a difference?
Is that a confound?
Yeah.
Right. So what you're pointing out is that, that's a very good question. What you're pointing out is that this gap is closer to the filler, that versus what, than that gap is.
Right.
Yeah. And so could the models just sort of be forgetting things? And the way we've tried to investigate this, I think there are different ways that people could try to investigate it. The way that this is sort of that disappearance of the effect. The way we've tried to investigate that is compare that pattern and the amount of distance talked about to the unboundedness study that we did here, where it's actually much longer sequences of words. So the linear distances are much larger in these 2, 3, 4, and 5. Oh, sorry, 1, 2, 3, and 4 levels. We're talking about much larger linear distances, but the effects seem to be a lot more mild. That's the way that we've looked at it. Now, I think there are other ways. There are other kinds of controlled experiments that you could do. I would encourage you to try to do them. But that's the way that we've tried to look at that. It's a very good question.
Okay, thank you. My second question is, you mentioned that we shouldn't be confusing what observations from the models and motivate using these results, theoretical accounts for human natural language.
Sure.
Right? And I think I've seen some work by, I forgot her name, but there's some work in the semantic literature that tried to motivate certain learnability accounts for universal constraints.
Yeah, sure. Like Shane Steiner-Threlkeld is one of the people who's done that work. Yeah.
Quantifiers, right?
Yeah.
And then I think his experiments are exactly like that. They say that there are some constraints could be learnability constraints. So certain quantifiers are more with
Yeah.
quantifiers, and we test that with neural net, I mean, that could be an account for human language, I guess, semantics. And I was wondering what your opinion would be on that framework.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. You know, I think the big picture is that, you know, I'm fine, I'm very excited about all this stuff. But I do want to point out, like, at the end of the day, okay, learnability has been central in the cognitive science of language, but also other things for decades. But I do want to point out that at the end of the day, any kind of sort of existence case proof with a computational model only does the following thing. So it makes assumptions about you have a corpus C, and then this is sort of perfect. Let's call this 100%, and this is 0%. And I'm going to hedge what that even means, okay? But sort of 100% is like as human-like as you can get, or as successful as you can get, and this is like no signal. And basically, you have some model that you use to get from the data, the corpus data, to some behavior, to some set of predictions. And you have some conclusions about how much something is learned. And so you get some number, okay? So what is that? So it's a lower bound on what you could get out of C, right? A different model could do even better, potentially. The problem is it's not a lower bound on what a human can get out of C, because humans operate under constraints that the model may not reflect. Unfortunately, it's also not a lower bound on what humans could get out of C in the following sense, that C, the corpus data, even if it's string data for sure, but even if it's like got some like auxiliary, like non-linguistic data attached, is a thinner slice of the experience that corresponds to that much linguistic data for a human. A human is learning in a richly grounded physical, social, conceptual context. And the models that we have today, they simply don't do that. And so the problem is that there's three problems. So one is that a better model could push you up. Richer information in terms of what's available to the human accompanied by C could push you up. Human limitations could push you down. And so this is a fuzzy enterprise. But that's always been the case in learnability. And I think in a sense, the conclusion is it's such an important problem that even these kinds of like roughly like getting some darts on the dartboard is helpful. And in particular, a lower bound on what could you learn from this, what could you possibly learn from that thing is nevertheless useful. And I think that is the kind of thing that we're offering. So going back to I bring this up as a much more general point. And I think the question with work on like quantifier acquisition is, are we representing the information types right? What's the role of compositionality, like the whole string, not just the individual word? Is the environment appropriately flexible? Is the environment too flexible? What are do we have the representations right? So with word sequences, in a sense, a lot of those things are solved. That's why, in a way, grammar is always more tractable to study. So I think, and then the other thing is basically like we don't know whether RNNs are, and in a sense, like we've seen that they have challenges for those things, for those cases. And so I think that, I think that the enterprise is a reasonable enterprise, but I think there's a lot of really severe challenges. And the other thing is that here we're able to use naturalistic data. These are corpus samples. And in those studies, it's artificial sort of hypothetical corpora that are synthetic. Yeah, very good question.
I have a question about human sentence processing, actually.
Yeah.
So you showed us in the beginning that if something unexpected comes up, then the surprisal is high is reflected in your eye tracking. Like
Yeah.
you stare at this word for a longer
Mhm.
time or something. I was wondering if you looked at that in L2 speakers of English, and if there's an influence of the speaker's first language, because maybe in their language the syntactic phenomenon works differently, and I'm wondering if it affects how they do English sentences and how they're.
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is the research program of a former postdoc of mine, Yevgeny Burzak, who just moved from MIT to the Technion. And that we actually have a paper at this year's CogSci proceedings that actually addresses this, which we have a larger journal article on in preparation. And you definitely get these effects. And the short thing to say is that like the word frequency effects are really magnified. I'm not showing you word frequency effects, but they exist even above and beyond word predictability effects, which is interesting in and of itself. Those effects are bigger for L2 speakers, even when you control for overall reading speed. Surprisal effects it's a more complex story. Then the question of does it depend on the native language? That is an open question that he's working on. There are some very, very suggestive preliminary signs that, for example, and I wouldn't sort of say that overall like these, so in studying reading, sort of the big three factors in terms of what affects the measurable things are generally word length, frequency, and predictability and context. Okay, so those big three, it's not clear that your native language matters that much for that above and beyond how proficient you are, which does. And by the way, one thing that he's shown is that you can actually do a very good job in predicting and estimating how proficient a non-native speaker is at English by projecting the features of their eye movement patterns into a high-dimensional space and seeing how much those patterns are like a native English speaker. So that actually is a very powerful technique you can use. You can actually predict reasonably well the proficiency of a non-native speaker. But this question of like different languages, different native language is much more open. So there's some suggestive evidence, for example, that if you're from a language, if you're reading English and you're a native speaker of a language that doesn't have determiners, for example, like Chinese or Japanese, you might not look much at the determiners unless you're very highly proficient. But I think that we don't have enough data to be really sure. I mean, at the individual tri-level, eye movements are still noisy. It's just when you aggregate them over many instances of reading, then the signal really comes out. Great question. I don't know. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So, you can ask comparing how machines or algorithms measure the difficulty based on the surprisal, but because they have fixed computation time, you have to use a low probability. Have you considered using adaptive computation time algorithms, such as Gray's et al. 2016,
Yeah.
where they have like an RNN that
Yeah.
can do more processing? It feels closer to what humans do.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that I think that it's very productive actually to think about those kinds of algorithms, those sort of, those kinds of effects fall out of those kinds of ideas, And I think that the bigger picture here is that when you see something where it's like a log probability matters, then you should think of it as some kind of like, that the system has done some kind of efficient coding into sort of, an efficient coding of the universe of possibilities into a space where description length is sort of indexed is linear indexing time. That's the short thing I'll say about that. But absolutely, it's a great point. Yeah. Go ahead, Laura. You can.
Since these models with grammatical priors like RNNG
Yeah.
perform so much better, these syntactic measures are more similar to things on these syntactic measures than like these huge transformers, for example. Like, what does that mean in the broader scope of NLP? Like, should pursuing these grammatical priors increases like human-like performance,
Yeah.
but not necessarily performance on these like huge kind of
Yeah.
leaderboards? Like, what does that mean? Like, does human performance scale to these leaderboards, or?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that, so first of all, like I think that in terms of the, I think we haven't done as much study of this as we should, but in terms of the accuracy scores, like how often the models get the right directions of the surprisals, the transformers actually do quite well. I didn't show you results on this, but they actually do quite well. However, as you see, their effect sizes are not necessarily that big. And so this sort of quantitative calibration is an interesting open frontier there. And I think it's quite plausible that like adding more grammatical structure and also there's other sort of algorithmic features that arise when you have symbolic structures like ambiguity of the parse, and that's a whole other can of worms. I think some of the sort of miscalibration cases are probably where people don't have exhausted, they're basically not representing all the parses. I mean, I could say a couple things. So first of all, like the advantages of RNNGs, I think it's not clear that they persist that robustly as you get to larger data set size. It's very hard to tell, but the big story is like it's a compute efficiency story, right? Which is the classic like transformers are just really like they're very convenient to work with, and the having that symbolic structure is very it imposes a lot of compute demands, and that's relevant both in training and inference time. And so that's just a huge bottleneck, which I think at the end of the day is why people keep coming, even the people most interested in, in neurosymbolic models keep on coming back in practice to like pure neural models when you really want to get something to work, because it's just like the compute time penalty often just outweighs whatever benefits that you want, unless it's something where you really need the discrete symbolic structure at some intermediate point for some other reason. Yeah.
A question back there?
Yeah, hi Roger. I have two questions. Sorry. Hi Roger. I have two questions actually. So my first question is about, so one of your conclusions was that because, the expectations of these neural language models
Yeah.
are quite different from human, sometimes terms used like base tracking data, that we can't necessarily say anything about human language processing from that. But I wonder if you would expect that, teaching these models to somehow be more similar to human performance.
Yeah. Great.
It actually help the models out.
Yeah, in terms of batching them better. So actually we have ongoing work like that. So for example, we have some work that tries to really instantiate. So Michael Hahn is doing some work that I'm involved in that really tries to give teeth to this idea of limitations on, it actually brings together these two ideas, noisy channel mechanisms and limitations of fidelity on memory representations. And so the idea is that we say that the representation of content, and so Richard Futrell and I sort of did the first work really sort of bringing out this idea, and Michael has taken it further. The idea is that you have these, you have a noisy channel representation of the context. So the context itself, the preceding string, is not really represented simply as a word sequence. You don't have veridical access to the past. You have a noisy, lossy representation of the past. Now, above and beyond that, then, you still can do inference from those noisy representations. But then you can ask the question, well, what's the sort of optimal lossiness of it? You can imagine that our memory systems themselves are adapted to the statistics of the language and efficiently preserve subsets of the information, partial information about contexts. And that, I think, comports with some broad ideas about human memory. And then we can link that up with this idea of Surprisal and implement the Surprisal model with we use GPT-2. And what it shows is that, remember that example where I had the doubly center embedded relative clause, and the model actually succeeded on that. Well, GPT-2 does even better than what I showed you there. It actually does too well. It's unhumanly like good. Okay? But if we include a noisy channel component to the representation of the context, then it actually brings a whole set of sort of unhuman-like behaviors, and actually ones where, in a sense, the model is performing too well, closer, more in line with the patterns that we see in human processing. So in a sense, if we go back to a very early slide that I just sort of introduced the whole thing, it's bringing teeth into this notion of memory limitations and the role that they play in language processing. So we can use, and so in a sense, the starting point is the language model. Another way to think about this is what's the same. A lot of people ask me, what's different about human language learning and processing and big deep learning model big deep learning model acquisition and processing? And I say, no, don't think about that. Think about what's the same. I'll tell you what the same thing is. Lots of exposure to experience, a premium on prediction and uncertainty management, efficient drive because of the difficulty of the task, the universe of possibilities for interpretation and prediction, a strong incentive to suck up all of the statistical contingency and information in the input that's available to do good prediction and uncertainty management. Those things are all the same. And of course, the data sets that the models are being trained on are, samples of human language. And so those things are all aligned, but there are other things that are really different. The capacity constraints are different, the multimodality is different, all those things are different. But if we sort of build in some of those differences back into the models, I do think we're going to be able to get back to get even more human-like behaviors. So yes, I think it's a very rich frontier. Great question, Emmy. Yeah. Please. Sorry, just say, I can't quite hear you.
Oh, sorry. So my second question was sort of about also that the base tracking data that they use.
Oh, yeah.
So you talked a lot about the processing time it takes to read all the work.
Yeah.
But also, I was wondering if you had looked into the surprise that people make at all, like when
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So that's a really, we have spent some time, I haven't worked on that recently, but my first PhD student, Clinton Bicknell, who's actually at Duolingo, so you could invite him over anytime to talk about this. Clinton actually worked a lot on this. So when do you move your eyes backwards? And that basically, to a first approximation, it's when there's a mismatch, but it's not just when you're surprised. You can be surprised to encounter a low frequency word. It's when there's a mismatch between there's a sign of a mismatch between the input and the context. And that's the driver. And actually, you can build a rational theory that derives that. And so he's done that kind of work. So, and I think that's a very, very rich topic. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
Yeah, sure, sorry. Yeah.
I mean, this is just a really minor follow-up to this top question. Does the data include like tracking of to which word?
Yep.
It looks back?
Mm-hmm.
Is there some way of like mapping out the actual syntax of the sentence?
Yeah, so that's a long story, and I'd be happy to talk about it at greater length. I think we've only scratched the surface of really looking at that. And there are, once again, it sort of goes back to these sort of, it connects to these like ideas of like only a noisy representation of the context. So there is work on that. One thing I'll say is that one of the favorite experiments that I've been involved in was one where we showed that if late in a sentence you get some input that for grammatical reasons makes you doubt whether a preceding word was really the word that it was, then you actually go back and look at that specific word. And, or you're more likely to than otherwise. And so those fine-grained contingencies do seem to matter. So yes, very good question. And we can model all those things, I think. And actually, I'd love to see people use the modern deep learning toolkit, because we were not using that. But we were doing this before that. And I think that the modern toolkit would really, really give a lot of power for that.
Okay, one more quick question.
It's like a follow-up to the previous question about like tracking and long-term dependencies. I was also wondering if you're able to explore how like humans like look back into the input for language generation, such as like monolingual language generation or the translation. Because like this is a little bit different from just like reading a text that's already there. So if you want to generate a new word, then if the new word has to depend on the previous context. We'll be able to like explore like how either eye gaze or another metric of what people look at can like influence the generation of text.
Yeah, that's very interesting and open-ended. I haven't looked at that. There are people who try to study like eye gaze and scene description. So when people are generating verbal descriptions of scenes, they look at where they look in the scene. So I could look up if you want. I'd be happy to try to help and find some of those references. That's not something I've worked on, but I know that it's. Sorry, I do know. No, actually, it's a prominent topic now that I think about it. Yes, I'll send you literature. Yes, that's definitely something people look at. Yeah, absolutely.
So we can continue questions over snacks, and for now, let's thank our speaker again.